All right. Hi guys. I'm just gonna go ahead and record. I wanted to go ahead and just record this quick lecture just on the end of World War One, so we can jump into the 1920s in class today on Monday. So I'm just gonna take 10 minutes here and go through the end of World War One, just so you guys have all that information before we move into the 1920s. So this is where we left off from last class. The previous slide that we were on, we were talking about what Woodrow Wilson had done to lessen or tighten up some of the restrictions, I should say, on what you could say against the U.S. government, what you could say against or about the military and the war as well. We saw that with the Espionage and Sedition Act, Schenck versus the United States. Basically, you have the U.S. Supreme Court saying that the U.S. government, when uh, basically the government can restrict freedom of speech if there is they kind of drew this comparison to yelling fire in a crowded room. If your free speech during peacetime can lead to violence, or in this case, lead to people not joining the war effort, then it could be deemed illegal, and was not barred by the First Amendment. I mentioned here you see people like Eugene Debs, and other socialists, especially, and people that were anti-war pacifists were targeted as well with these. Debs actually was sentenced to 10 years in prison, would run from prison, would run for president from there. We also had the slacker raids that were carried out specifically by the APL, and targeted mainly people that were seen as doing what they could to undermine the war, but oftentimes it would be used against Germans specifically. So the War Industries Board, this was really important in coordinating production, and their main goal was to settle disputes between labor unions and producers, and so industrialists or factory owners. The goal here was not necessarily respect the needs of the labor union or the uh, industrialist or the factory. It was, how do we reach an agreement and get the production going for the war? Victory gardens. People were encouraged to have their own gardens in their backyard. They were called victory gardens because if you are growing your own food, your own vegetables and stuff, then the produce and other goods that you would get normally from the store could be sent overseas. That was kind of the idea of it. During this time, we also see the Great Migration, which is shown by this graph here, this map here. You can see there are two. The second one will be after the Second World War, and you can see those primarily head out west. But during the First World War, we get the Great Migration north. Tons of factory jobs opened in northern factories, and so we see a large migration of African American Americans up to fill those northern jobs. So women, African Americans, really did their part during this time to help with the war efforts. We'll kind of talk about it later on as we get to the post-war years. But unfortunately, helping out in this regard with the factories up north and with production doesn't necessarily translate to victories in terms of race relations and stuff in the United States. African Americans are still going to have to sort of prove themselves, unfortunately, in a lot of ways after this. But nevertheless, the Great Migration is huge to filling up a lot of the cities up north, but also fulfilling those jobs that opened up when the soldiers went overseas. Let's see here. The National War Labor Board worked in tandem with the War Industries Board to settle those labor disputes that I was talking about before. But it is important here to take note that America still, at least on the surface, exhibited a lot of a big commitment to these laissez-faire attitudes. We will see this absolutely going into the 1920s. And then early on in the 1930s with the response to the Great Depression. And we'll see this kind of laissez-faire, hands-off attitude, let the economy, let the government work itself out. That attitude still carries the day. So women, as I mentioned before, going to flood into a lot of the factory jobs that fill the roles of the men who left the assembly line to go over to the front lines. Now, the war actually is going to split the suffrage movement, as many were pacifists. So many of the same suffragists who wanted voting rights for women also were pacifists and disavowed war. The NAWSA supported the war as a means to gain democracy at home. So the idea here is kind of you prove your worth, if you will. The National American Women's Suffrage Association saw women flooding into these jobs as a way to kind of prove to the United States government their worth. Quaker leader, though Alice Paul, she was a very influential feminist and suffragist. She also was Quaker. So Quakers are pacifists. I mentioned how religious exemptions were not granted for the war. I'm going to talk about that here on the next slide. Those were not granted, but nevertheless, Quakers still were pacifists. Just in their religion, they were taught to be peaceful. And so Alice Paul was a very outspoken critic of World War I, as well as supporting the war too. Wilson would go on to endorse women's suffrage as vitally necessary. He called it, and the women in 1920 will get the 19th Amendment will be ratified by the required amount of states and will take effect in 1920. So you can see here just the women during the war, a couple different jobs that they did during the wartime, such as working with the Red Cross, working as ambulance drivers, nurses, but then also hello girls. So those that would handle communications that took place near the front lines. So let's talk about the Selective Service Act here really quick. There is a draft that is instituted in 1917. Now, Wilson did not like the draft. He was old enough he was very well read. He was old enough to remember, but then also just to have read about the draft riots that took place during the Civil War and the opposition to it. But virtually every European country, major European country, adopted a conscription process of some kind of process, because the World War I turns into a war of attrition, which, for those of you that don't remember, a war of attrition, normally when you are trying to defeat an enemy, you have a location or a destination as your goal. Battle of Bunker Hill, Battle of Breed's Hill. You're trying to take over those locations for strategic purposes. Bombing a Fort Sumter, trying to take over a military fort for a Confederate at that time it was a Southern state advantage. War of attrition, the goal is not to get to a location or to take over more enemy trenches than your enemy does of yours. It is to wear down your enemy more than they wear you down. So you need people, you need men. And so that is to kind of keep up with that demand, because, as brutal as it sounds, so many Europeans, and then also Americans too, are just going to be torn to shreds by the machine guns, by the heavy artillery. And so we needed a draft as well. Notice there's no purchasing exemptions here. So in the draft during the Civil War, there were options to either buy out your draft, so you could pay a certain amount to get out of the draft, or you could pay somebody else to take your place. And of course, this only favored the wealthy, those that could afford it. If you couldn't afford your purchase status, you had to go to war, assuming you passed the medical exam. Let's see here. The Wobblies were the IWW, the International Workers of the World. They protested and many were jailed. There were African Americans that were conscripted. They were drafted. They were not trained to fight, and they were relegated more to labor roles. But within a few months, the Army grows to nearly 4 million. Now, in total, about 24 million people sign up for the draft and fell into that age range. Many of them did not pass there were IQ tests that were given, but then also health tests, basic health tests to test your eyesight for nearsightedness. Many of them were nearsighted and didn't have the proper eye care. And also, many were wounded. Many were wounded not from previous wars or previous military experience. They were wounded from their jobs. Their industrial accidents were rampant. Um, and so there were many that actually failed their wellness exam because of their job experiences. But ultimately, as I said, you get about 4 million men. Let's see here. So, you can pause here and take a look at a couple of the battles, the major battles that American forces were involved in. If you would like, let's see. The trenches, this should be a bit of a review if you recall from freshman year, or even if you had the sophomore honors class last year. I know you guys talked about World War One. Trenches are dug in a zigzag pattern. I think we remember this primarily to help disrupt artillery fire, but then also during trench raids, a an occupying force can't just shoot right down the line. There's turns and there's corners that they would have to shoot around. So it was also for safety. But this just gives you an overview of most trench networks, and this is where I really wanted to get the end of World War One. So obviously, if this was not a push and I didn't have to get through this material so quickly, I could easily spend a full week talking about the end of the war, but I'm going to try to do so here in a few minutes. So German allies, Austria-Hungary Ottomans, they had deserted the Germans in the spring of 1918, and there were still German military leaders who felt that this war could be won, but the general feeling of the soldiers who are fighting in this conflict on those front lines is it was time to surrender. It was time to give up. The British blockade was now leading to starvation. On unbelievable levels, not just for soldiers on the front lines, but also for German or citizens back home. And on top of that, the Germans are just seeing this endless supply of millions of healthy, well-fed American soldiers who are coming to the aid of the British and French soldiers. So, Wilson's 14 points, his 14-point speech that he gives in January of 1918 appeals to many Germans especially. And they kind of saw Wilson's 14 points. You can take a look at your notes from last week if you would like to refresh those. And they saw the 14 points as a way forward after this surrender to rebuild Germany in a way that would be fair to them. And so ultimately, the Kaiser is going to be overthrown, and Germany agrees to an armistice that would end the war, at least end the fighting. You still need a formal end to the war, which we'll see with the Treaty of Versailles. But the fighting comes to an end at 11 o'clock on the 11th day, the 11th month, 1918. And soldiers talked about how it was eerie because it was 10:59 and then 11 rolls around and it's just this constant din, this constant thunder of artillery that you heard some people for 3, 4 years just rolled away. And now the question is, what happens next? The new government, the Weimar Republic, is going to replace the Kaiser's government after he is overthrown, and they will be the ones primarily handling these end of the war negotiations that results in the armistice. But as I said, we still need a formal end to this war, which will come with the Treaty of Versailles. Okay. So the Treaty of Versailles, Woodrow Wilson, because he knew that his 14-point speech was very influential on the Germans, he wanted to make sure that he was there to kind of speak on its behalf. After all, the 14 points is his speech. The League of Nations, the 14th point is kind of his baby, is kind of his brainchild. So he wanted to make sure that he could be there to advocate for it, but also to make sure that Britain and France, who want nothing but punitive measures against the Germans. We wanted to make sure that their words wouldn't rule the day. And ultimately, they're going to. The United States was represented by Woodrow Wilson. Vittorio Orlando was there representing Italy. Their voices are pretty much drowned out to Lloyd George and Clemenceau of Britain and France, who will control much of the negotiations. And ultimately, you can see down here, I see the Treaty of Versailles is vindictive, whereas the 14 points was idealistic. There was no middle ground there. Um, 14 points sounds fantastic. Wilsonian idealism sounds fantastic. It's not always easy to implement in place. Being vindictive, which is what the British and French are going to do, it sounds great if you're the British or the French, because you are punishing the mighty Germans who have, especially if you're the French have kind of served as a threat for the last several years. But just like this idealism, it's not perfect. You kind of need a middle ground here of agreeing that yes, there needs to be some repayments by the losers, if you will, the Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, and of course Germany. But also, you need to set them up in a way that is not going to result in widespread economic issues, not just for Germany, but also for the rest of the world. Wilson realized quite intelligently that the Germans, the best thing to do would be to set the Germans up to be a world, not a world superpower. You're not looking because, France was very worried about Germany doing this again. Um, and so you don't set the Germans up to be this military might that can kind of throw its weight around Europe. But what Wilson said was you need to set them up to be an industrial player. They were industrialized before. We had relied on trade and commerce with them, as did many other countries in Europe. So you have to make sure that their economy is strong enough to do so. But ultimately, that does not work. The French wanted nothing but vengeance, and they wouldn't even invite the Germans to this negotiations. And so ultimately, you can see here the Treaty of Versailles is going to lead to some of these big losses here for the Germans. The most, what I would say is probably the thing that is used most against um, the British and the French by the Germans and eventually the Nazis as they rise into power is this war guilt clause here, which places sole responsibility of the conflict on the Germans. And it also, with that, forced them to pay $33 billion in reparation payments to the Allies over 30 years. And it simply was not going to happen. The German response to these debts is the printing press. They begin to print more money. And I'm not kidding you when I say at the height of German inflation in the post-war years in the 20s and early 30s, one US dollar was equivalent to over 3 trillion German marks. That's trillion with a T. So that just gives you a sense of how inflated the currency becomes. And unfortunately, all that instability, all that economic hardship is only going to provide fertile ground for the Nazis and eventually Adolf Hitler to come into power and sort of serve as this quote unquote savior of the German people. And that obviously is not going to be good for anybody except for those Germans at the time who really needed they needed kind of a shot to the arm because the Treaty of Versailles is just going to harm their economy so much. You can see here it also greatly restricts their military size. The German military was over 10 million strong in World War I at its peak. It's going to be reduced down to a size of 100,000 men. They could not buy submarines, could not build an air force. They had to relinquish all overseas colonies. They had to return certain regions to France as well. And also, the League of Nations will be established, but we will talk about why ultimately the League of Nations is not very successful. So remember, a president cannot ratify a treaty. He can negotiate the terms, but he's got to come back and get it ratified by Congress. And here is the horrible irony of the League of Nations. Again, this is an American president who is pushing this forward. It is his main idea. And it's a great idea when you look at the alternative, which is just, picking up arms and fighting each other on the battlefield, which nobody wanted. Again, after experiencing the hell that was World War One, it's a good idea. Sort things out diplomatically across the table rather than across the battlefield. But ultimately, Woodrow Wilson cannot convince these two groups to ratify the treaty itself. The main objection was the League of Nations. The irreconcilables, led by Hiram Johnson, approve a treaty so long as the League of Nations was included. As long as they called it a useless sewing circle, they saw it as nothing more than world leaders sitting around trying to solve problems and getting nowhere. And an overpotent super state, they called it as well. They kind of saw it as possibly being this international organization that would be able to overrule the mandates or laws passed by the United States Congress, especially those pertaining to other countries and any conflicts therein. And there were reservationists who said, we'll ratify the treaty, but we gotta make some major changes here. And Wilson refused to compromise. He would not meet them halfway. And so ultimately, the treaty was rejected by Congress. So it's technically the United States was in a state of war against Germany and Austria-Hungary until 1921, when the Congress formally passed a series of resolutions to settle those. And that's not to say we were fighting with them. There was no more gunfire exchanged, but we never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson could not convince the irreconcilables and the reservationists on the League of Nations. They just saw it as the United States. If we ratify the treaty with the League of Nations, it would just provide another avenue to get us involved in world conflicts that we, in the eyes of those in Congress, they didn't think we needed to get into those conflicts. So some ironies in history that you see, and one of the biggest ones that I always teach about every year is we've got the League of Nations, this idea from an American president. It's passed by other countries over in Europe, a couple thousand miles away, but he couldn't get his own home to ratify it. So, okay. All right, guys. So that's all I got for you. I just wanted to get through World War One because today in class we are working on the 1920s. So thank you guys for watching. I hope everybody has a great Easter and Easter break, and we'll see you guys when you return.